Welcome to the fourth month, the month of Tammuz. And let's take stock of where we are. So we just closed the books on the first quarter, the first 3 months of the Jewish calendar. Nisan, Iyar, Sivan. In past Shurim, our discussions about those months were dominated by themes that were based on the biblical calendar of the holidays, right? So we had Pesach in the first month, then Sfirat HaOmer through the second month, until we reach Shavuot in the third. That was Q1, okay? Now, as we enter Q2, you could say that there is a vibe shift that takes place. And here's one way to think about it. If the Jewish calendar was a musical score, then Q1 would be written in major, right? You have Yetziat Mitzrayim, you have Ma'amad Har Sinai. So the year starts with a bang. The Exodus, the Revelation, starts with a bang. But now, as we enter the fourth month of Tammuz, you could say the tune starts to change. The musical score shifts into a more brooding and somber minor key, because soon we'll be entering into the period of the 3 weeks. And that runs from Shiva Asar Tammuz until Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av. And this is a period of national mourning for the tragedies of Jewish history. And it's centered around the tragedy par excellence of our people, the destruction of the Beit Mikdash twice, and our subsequent exile from the land of Israel twice. Okay, so tonight, as we enter the month of Tammuz, we're going to think a little bit about this period of the 3 weeks. What's it about, and what are some of the messages that we can take away from it? And in this series of Shirim, I've always tried to look at some sources that get us into the mood for the month. So we're going to start with a Mishnah from Ta'anit, which explains that these 2 fast days of Shiva Asar Tammuz and Tisha B'Av commemorate more than just the destruction of the temples, but they commemorate a whole host of calamities that have befallen our people. Okay, so let me put that up on screen, and we'll go through it inside. Okay, so hopefully people can see that. Okay, so this is what it says in the Mishnah in Ta'anit. It says, Chamisha dvarim eru'u et avotenu b'shiva asar Tammuz. So there were 5 tragic events that happened to our forefathers on the 17th of Tammuz, v'chamisha b'tisha b'av. And another 5 tragedies happened on Tisha B'av. B'shiva asar Tammuz, nishtabru haluchot. So on the 17th of Tammuz, the luchot, the tablets, were broken by Moshe. Uvatal hatamid. And in Roman times, the daily offering was nullified, was stopped. Vehuv ke'ah ha'ir, and the walls of the city of Yerushalayim were breached. The saraf apostemos et haTorah. There's a debate about exactly what this situation is, but a certain Greek or Roman burned the Torah, and that was a tragic event. Vehamid selim beheichal, and another tragic event. Also, there are different opinions of when this happened, but the putting of an idol in the Beit HaMikdash itself. So, okay, so those are 5 tragedies that happened on Shiva Asar Tammuz. The Tisha B'Av, Nigzar al avotenu shelo yiknesu la'aretz, shelo yikansu la'aretz. So on Tisha B'Av, the first tragedy that we commemorate is that the generation of the spies, it was decreed upon them that they would not enter Eretz Yisrael. Second, v'charav habayit barishana uvashniya. And so the first and second temples, the first and second Batei Mikdash, were destroyed on Tisha B'Av. V'nilkada Beitar, and the city of Beitar, the town of Beitar, was captured during the Bar Kokhba revolt. V'nechrasha ha'ir, and the city of Jerusalem was plowed over by the Romans so that it would never be rebuilt. Okay, so 5 tragedies on Shiva Asar Tammuz, 5 tragedies on Tisha B'Av. Okay, let me stop sharing. Stop sharing. Okay, so let's think about that a little bit. So the presentation in the Mishnah is actually striking. The 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av are described not as commemorations of single events, which I think is, if you might have thought that they commemorated certain events centered around the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, but rather the Mishnah presents these days as part of an extended history of tragedy that spans through the generations, all the way back to the generation of Egypt, through the first temple, through the second temple period, and even after the Khurban, all the way up basically to the time of the Mishnah itself, because you have to keep in mind that the Mishnah was written in about the year 200, and among the tragedies listed in the Mishnah, we mentioned is the tragedy of Beitar during the Bar Kokhba revolt. That's about the year 135, so about 65 years before the writing down of the Mishnah. And the traditions that are in the Mishnah are older potentially than even its final codification. So in the Mishnah's lists, that list of tragedies, right? Let's just say the Bar Kokhba revolt as another tragedy in this age-old cycle. That would be a tragedy in the times of the Mishnah that was closer to the times of the Mishnah than the Holocaust is to our times, right? So I think that's important to keep in mind. When we read the Mishnah in the year 2022, we think of it as reading a series of ancient events, that happened a long time ago. But to the authors of the Mishnah or to the original readers of the Mishnah, they would have read it as a series of tragedies leading up basically to their own time, right? And so the message of the Mishnah seems to be something like this. These fast days are not just about expressing our sadness for something that happened in the distant past, but they're about waking us up to a trend in our history, which unfortunately includes a series of tragedies that seem to keep happening all the way up to our own times. So of course we mourn for the past, but we also see the past, you might say, as a hazard sign for the future, because these types of things seem to happen over and over. And just as the rabbis, just as Chazal broadened the frame of what we're mourning, not just the destruction of the temples, but this broader cycle or series of tragedies throughout our history, so too they expand the period of when we mourn. So not just the 2 days listed in the Mishnah, but rather a full 3-week period of national mourning and introspection every year, right? We call it the 3 weeks. So what are we to make of this? What are we to make of this expansion of a 3-week period in which we commemorate a history and a series of tragedies? So I think there are actually 2 overlapping things that are going on with the customs of the 3 weeks. And it's worth it to separate them because they are 2 separate things. One aspect has to do with Chazal teaching us about memory and mourning and loss, right? And that's a theme that we'll actually pick up on a little bit more next month when we focus on the month of Av. That's not what I want to focus on this month, because I think there's a second aspect of the customs of the 3 weeks that's also worth focusing on, a little different than mourning, and that's the theme of a wake-up call. Okay, and here's what I mean. So connecting the 17th of Tammuz to Tisha B'Av in a 3-week period of mourning and introspection is meant to focus us on the fact that these tragedies don't happen all of a sudden out of nowhere. They actually play out over time. They actually play out in slow motion. So for example, think about the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So on Shivas Arba Tammuz, we commemorate that the walls of Yerushalayim were breached, as we learned in the Mishnah. Now you might say, the Beit HaMikdash is going to be destroyed 3 weeks later. And once you realize that the ultimate destruction is coming on a date that's 3 weeks into the future, why bother mourning the breach of the walls as something separate? Okay, the breach of the walls feels like a detail in the story once you know how the story ends, and ends quite soon. But perhaps Chazal are telling us they're trying to wake us up to a certain dynamic, which is the tragedy doesn't just happen out of nowhere, at least sometimes. Sometimes it plays out in slow motion, and as it happens, we often allow ourselves to be more like spectators than actors. It's almost like we're watching this play out. And I want to argue that part of what Chazal were trying to achieve in mandating this period of mourning and introspection that's 3 weeks long is to drive us, you could say it's to create an intervention, a wake-up call. Because we can't undo the history that's already happened, but we can use that history to wake us up today So we try to break this negative cycle that we often fall into, and so that we don't sleepwalk into the next tragedy. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about that theme of the 3 weeks as a wake-up call, as a call to not just sit by and see the decline happen, but rather to be kind of awoken to engagement and to try to make things better in your own time, in today. Okay, so one place that we see this theme of Chazal's view of the 3 weeks as a wake-up call can be seen in the special Haftarot that we read at this time of year. So during the 3 weeks, we read 3 special Haftarot. We call them the Haftarot of affliction, the Tflat de Puranuta. Okay, those are 3 weeks in which we read special Haftarot in which the prophets give us some tough love. Okay, we read from the beginning of the books of Yirmiyahu and Yeshayahu. Both of them really give some tough love. And later on, after Tisha B'Av, we'll read the 7 Haftarot of consolation, but that's for another time. For now, we're in the 3 weeks of the Haftarot of affliction. Now, I should say, we often don't pay as much attention to the Haftarot as we probably could. So for a lot of people, the Haftarah is pretty much party time. It's the Kiddush Club is during the Haftarah. So and even the people who are inside are often not as focused on it as, let's say, they are on the Parsha. So I actually kind of like that we're going to spend a little extra time tonight paying attention to the Haftarah in particular. So this is what I want to do. Let me put them up on screen. We'll go through, we're not going to go through all of the Haftarot because obviously that's a lot, but we're going to go through a few highlights. I think we can go through enough that you'll get a feel for what each of the 3 weeks, each of the 3 special Haftarot are about. So let me share screen again and we'll go through that. Okay, so this is week 1. So week 1 is the beginning of the book of Yirmiyahu. And the first chapter of the book of Yirmiyahu is a whole section which has to do with, actually we talked a bit about it last month when we were talking about Nevuah, because that's the introduction to Yirmiyahu as a prophet, and that whole section about Hashem coming to Yirmiyahu and saying, what do you see? And he says, I see a pot bubbling over. Hashem says, I will bring destruction from the north. So anyways, this first section, which I've just brought a couple of psukim to give a feel for, is, Hashem, Hashem touches his mouth and puts words into the mouth of Yirmiyahu. He says, I've appointed you over the nations and the kingdoms to uproot and to pull down, to destroy, to overflow, to overthrow, to build and to plant. So this is just an example of the beginning of the Haftarah. But I think the punchline of the Haftarah comes towards the end, where it says, Halach v'karata ve'oznei Yerushalayim lemor, ko amar Hashem, zacharti lach chesed neuraich. And this has become obviously a very famous line as a song, and then in the Yamim Noraim, we say it in the davening, say, Avatlu latayich lech techacharai b'midbar be'eretz lo zerua. Go proclaim to Yerushalayim, so says Hashem, I remember the devotion of your youth, your love as a bride, when you followed me into the desert. So basically this is Hashem looking back at the beginning of the relationship with Am Yisrael when we followed Hashem into the desert after Yetziat Mitzrayim, and then it says, Kodesh Yisrael Hashem, Reshit Vu'ata, again, kind of expressing the love of Hashem for Bnei Israel in this romantic kind of way, romantic imagery. So that kind of gives a sense of what the first Haftarah is about. Okay, then we go on to the second week. Second week actually is just a continuation from the book of Yirmiyahu. The second week picks up where the first one left off, and it starts to have a little bit of a different focus. It says, Komar Hashem, Mamatzu avotechem bi avel ki rachaku me'alai. What wrongs did your fathers find in me that they abandoned me? And then as we go on, it says, has any nation changed its gods even though they are no gods? Again, this sense of people abandoning Hashem. For my people have done a twofold wrong. It says, Oti azvu mekor mayim chayim lachatzov lahem be'orot be'orot. So they've forsaken me, the fountain of living water. right? So this is, and the theme kind of carries on, going forward. It says, that azavta et Hashem Elokecha, right? You've forsaken Hashem your God, and the theme just goes on and on and on. That you've, and it's written actually in quite harsh language. That you have strayed from God in the way that a zonah, a prostitute, is not true to any man. And then, and you have as many finally you have as many gods as you have towns. So the theme is pretty clear. Again, I haven't gone through every pasuk and every word, but the theme of the second haftarah is pretty clear, that it's about Hashem, Bnei Israel straying from Hashem. And again, this with the image of the zonah and kind of going astray, it follows, whereas the first week we were the loving bride following into the wilderness, and the second week we're the straying, untrue partner to Hashem. And then in the third week, this actually comes from the beginning of the book of Yeshayahu. So Yeshayahu, Hashem says to Yeshayahu, Lama li rov zivchechem, Yomar Hashem. Why do I need your sacrifices? Hashem basically says, this is not what I want. I've had enough of all of these bulls. I have no delight in your lambs and in your goats. I get no joy from your sacrifices. And then it says, a little bit later on, it says, Dirshu mishpat, right? Devote yourselves to justice. Shiftu yatom. You should judge the orphan, and you should defend the widow. And then a few psukim later, again, we say, it talks about that you should be, it says, Maleti mishpat tzedek, that the city was filled with justice. And then as you go on, it continues to talk about the orphan and the widow, and the punchline of the third week of that haftarah is Tzion b'mishpat tipadeh v'shaveh b'tzedakah, that Tzion will be saved in mishpat. This translation says in the judgment, but I think right, it's judgment will be the salvation of Tzion, right? So again, we have 3 weeks with 3 different themes, and just in case that wasn't clear, as I was trying to build it just by giving a sense of the psukim themselves, let me just recap it in case that wasn't clear. So it seems that in these 3 haftarot, the relationship between Hashem and Bnei Israel is likened, I would say, to a broken marriage. Okay? In fact, in these haftarot, Hashem, through the voice of the prophets, lays out, you might say, the betrayed spouse's grievances, as if we're in couples therapy with Hashem for a relationship that's lost its thrill. So it's like we're being invited to marriage counseling by the prophets on behalf of God, and the flow of the conversation is something like this. In the first week, we remember that there was once an amazing relationship that was worth saving, that we were once in love. Zacharti lach chesed nurayich. I remember your youthful love. In the second week, we describe the breaches of trust, the infidelities, and the betrayals. And then in the third week, Yeshayahu comes with really the punch. He hits the hardest. And you might say that what he's getting at is that maybe the rift in the relationship between God and his people is even deeper. So God, as the betrayed spouse, asks the Jewish people, what have you become? Are we still compatible? Or have you changed into someone so different than when we first met that we don't even share the same goals and the same hopes and dreams anymore? Hashem says, have we drifted too far apart? Are you so focused on the things that don't really matter, and you've forgotten the things that really do matter? Justice and doing the right, acting in justice, being kind to the orphan and the widow, etc. And so again, what I would argue is that these 3 haftarot are the rabbi's way of staging an intervention for us. You might say that they're dragging us to couples therapy with Hashem through the mouths of the prophets, who are telling us a harsh truth that we may not want to hear, which is that if you want to understand our greatest downfalls in this 3-week period, then we have to fess up and we have to face our greatest betrayals, because those are linked. And I think that's inherent in the Mishnah. When the Mishnah lays out the 5 tragedies, each one starts with a betrayal. So the first tragedy of Shivas Tammuz is the breaking of the Luchot. The breaking of the Luchot is the end of the story of the golden calf. So just after the Exodus from Egypt, we already stray. Right after the revelation at Sinai, we already stray. So that's our first betrayal of the generation of Egypt. Then the first tragedy on the list for Tisha B'Av is the tragedy of the spies, right? It says that the Tisha B'Av happened on the day of the decree that the generation of the spies would die out in the desert. That's a result of the second great betrayal of Bnei Israel in the Torah, which is that instead of following Hashem into the land, they betray him and don't have that level of trust. So I think what Chazal are saying in the Mishnah is that at the root of the series of tragedies that each of these fast days commemorates, right? We have a series of 5 tragedies in each case. Each one begins with a betrayal. And I think that what they're saying is that we have a history of tragedy, but you might say we also have a history of letting Hashem down. Maybe you could say of letting ourselves down. And of course, there are many factors at play in the way that history plays out. But to some extent, we have to take responsibility for our own destinies. And we have to see ourselves and our own actions and our own betrayals as at least a part of the story. And that's something that we can fix. So when you think about it, this theme of betrayal actually makes sense for this time of year as well, in the sense that, as I mentioned when we started, the year starts off with a punch in Major, Pesach, Shavuot. The holidays mark the early relationship between Bnei Israel and Hashem. That is the story of Chesed Ne'urayich. That is Yetziat Mitzrayim. That's the period historically in which we were the closest in our early, let's say, honeymoon period with Hashem, but also in the year itself, just in the cycle of the year. We start the year off, we start the months off with a series of holidays in which we're super focused, right? We're really engaged. We have Pesach. The Seder is the most widely practiced ritual in all of Judaism. Even unaffiliated folks, for the most part, find time to have a Seder with their families. It's the most practiced ritual in Judaism. And of course, for people who are more affiliated, the cycle of the holidays that we start off with runs through the first 3 months of the year. Pesach, Sfirat HaOmer, Shavuot. We're constantly engaged with our Judaism. But then, when the first quarter ends, you might say, from a calendar perspective, the honeymoon is over. Pesach has passed, Shavuot has passed, and at the next chunk of the year, after all those holidays and all the prep and all the specialness of that time of year is over, you might say, the question is, are we going to remain passionate? Are we going to remain faithful? Is the relationship going to stagnate in the course of the year, as in history? So each week during this time of year, which happens also to be the time of the historical betrayals, but also, again, I'm trying to say, even in a year, it's the time in which it is almost natural to lose some of the fire, to lose some of the passion of the early part of the year, okay? The rabbis, Chazal, bring the voices of Yirmiyahu and Yeshayahu through the Haftarot of those special weeks to prophesy against us or to us, not just against our forefathers, but actually to bring their message to us today, to wake us up. Because after the honeymoon of the holidays is over, we don't want to have to fall into the next stereotypical script, part of the script, which would be the relationship kind of going cold, okay? So anyways, hopefully that got across a message of the 3 weeks, of the 3 Haftarot, of this idea of wake-up call, and I'll just sum it up. So we're entering a period in the Jewish calendar where we stop celebrating the amazing things that Hashem did for us, or at least that's not the focus, and we start focusing less on the astonishing triumphs of Jewish history, but instead on the tragedies that are also part of Jewish history. And Chazal are careful to point out that we should not view our decline as inevitable, but instead, we're called on to break the cycle. So that's the idea of the wake-up call. That Chazal bring the voices of the prophets back from the dead, you could say, to speak to us in Shul in each of the 3 weeks, to wake us up, to give us a bit of tough love, and to take us to a sort of couples therapy with God. That's what the prophets did in their day. They spoke out to people and tried to wake them from sleepwalking into tragedy. And if we don't have new prophets today, then Chazal bring the old ones to speak to us. Okay? So with that, I want to wish all of us a month in which we stay fired up and where we keep the honeymoon going, you could say. But if it starts to fade, that we're open to voices that call us back anytime that we lose focus. Okay, Chodesh Tov, everyone.